The heavy mahogany doors of the Sterling estate didn't just close behind me 5 years ago. They slammed with a finality that felt like a death sentence. I stood on the rain-slicked driveway of the house I'd grown up in, clutching a single leather briefcase that held the wreckage of my life. Behind those doors, my father, Alistair Sterling, was likely pouring a glass of 20-year-old scotch, celebrating the fact that he had finally purged the weak link from the family bloodline. My brother, Julian, would be smiling that shark-like grin of his, knowing he had successfully pinned a $50 million offshore deficit on me, the brother who had always been too quiet, too cautious, and too disappointing to be a real Sterling. "Don't bother looking back, Silas," Alistair had spat at me just minutes before, his voice echoing through the vaulted marble foyer. "You were born with every advantage, and you turned out to be a common thief and a failure. From this moment on, you are a ghost to this family. You don't use the name. You don't call. You don't exist." My mother, Beatrice, hadn't even looked up from her tea. My sister, Vivian, had simply scrolled through her phone, her silence a sharp blade that cut deeper than any of Alistair's insults. I was the family disappointment, the scapegoat for Julian's reckless gambling in the Macau markets, and I was being cast out into a world I was supposedly too soft to handle. But as I stood there in the downpour, watching the lights of the mansion flicker through the trees, I didn't feel broken, I felt light. For the first time in 32 years, I wasn't carrying the weight of their impossible expectations. I walked toward the gate, not realizing that exactly 5 years later, those same people would be walking toward me, begging for a mercy I no longer owed them. The transition from a Sterling prince to a ghost was brutal. I moved to a city where the Sterling name didn't hold the weight of a mountain. I lived in a studio apartment that could fit inside my father's walk-in closet. I worked 18-hour days, not in the glamorous high-rises of Midtown, but in the gritty, neon-lit basements of the fintech world. I used the small, untraceable inheritance from my grandmother, the only Sterling who had ever truly loved me, and I started building, while Julian was busy spending the family's dwindling fortune on yachts and vanity projects to keep the Sterling global facade alive. I was creating a ghost in the machine. I was building Sterling Sovereign. Fast forward 5 years. The financial world is a fickle beast, and the Sterling global empire, once thought to be invincible, was bleeding out. Julian's recklessness hadn't stopped with the $50 million hole he'd blamed on me. It had grown into a systemic rot. They were over-leveraged, their assets were being seized, and the golden boy had led them to the edge of a cliff. It was a Tuesday morning when the phone rang in my private office on the 82nd floor of the Sovereign Tower. My assistant, a sharp woman named Marcus, buzzed through. "Mr. Sterling, you have a group of individuals in the lobby. They don't have an appointment, but they claim to be family." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the skyline. The Sovereign Tower was the most exclusive financial institution in the country. We didn't just handle money, we handled power. We were the lender of last resort for the elite, the place you went when the traditional banks turned their backs. My name wasn't on the public advertisements. The bank operated on whispers and high-level referrals. To the world, the owner of Sterling Sovereign was a shadowy figure known only as S. Sterling. My family, in their arrogance, had assumed that S stood for my father's estranged brother, Saul, who had passed away years ago. They thought they were coming to claim a dead man's legacy to save their own skins. "Send them up, Marcus," I said, my voice as cold as the glass of my window. "And make sure the boardroom is prepared." I watched the security feed. The elevator doors opened, and out stepped the ghosts of my past. Alistair looked older, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on a frame that had been humbled by stress. Beatrice was draped in pearls, but her eyes were darting around the opulent lobby with a desperation she couldn't hide. Julian was there, sweating through his shirt, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. Vivian trailed behind, her usual haughtiness replaced by a thin veil of terror. They walked through the corridors of my empire, gazing at the original Basquiat's on the walls and the floor-to-ceiling views of the harbor. They had no idea that the disappointment they had discarded was the one who owned the air they were breathing. As they approached the boardroom, I stood behind the frosted glass door, listening to their hushed, frantic whispers. "We have to get this loan, Alistair," Beatrice hissed. The creditors are at the door of the Gables. If we don't secure the bridge financing today, they'll seize the estate by Friday. I know, Beatrice. Alistair snapped, though his voice lacked its usual thunder. Julian, you're sure about this, Sterling? If it's Saul's estate, we have a legal claim to preferential terms. The documents say Sterling is the sole proprietor, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. It has to be the trust Uncle Saul set up. Who else could build a bank this size in 5 years? Certainly not that loser Silas. He's probably waiting tables in some dive bar by now. Vivian sighed. I still can't believe we're stooping to this. Begging a ghost for money. We aren't begging, Alistair corrected her, straightening his tie. We are reclaiming what is ours by right of blood. Now, be silent. The CEO is coming. I signaled Marcus. The heavy, soundproof doors of the boardroom hummed open. My family filed in, sitting on one side of the massive obsidian table, their backs to the window. They didn't see me at first. I was standing in the shadows of the corner, watching them. Thank you for seeing us, Alistair began, addressing the empty chair at the head of the table. We are representatives of Sterling Global. We are here to discuss a matter of urgent liquidity and a potential partnership between our two legacies. He paused, looking around the room. Is the CEO not present? I stepped out of the shadows. The light from the midday sun hit my face, and the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it might crack the floor. Beatrice let out a small, strangled gasp. Julian's jaw literally dropped, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Vivian froze, her hand halfway to her mouth. But it was Alistair's reaction that I savored the most. The color drained from his face until he looked like a marble statue of a man who had just realized he was standing on a trapdoor. Hello, Father, I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any heat. You're late for your appointment. But then again, you always were a bit slow to recognize a changing market. Silas? Vivian whispered, her voice trembling. What are you doing here? Are you the assistant? I walked slowly to the head of the table and sat down in the leather chair they had been waiting for. I folded my hands in front of me, looking at each of them in turn. I'm the founder, I said. I'm the chairman. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, when I purchased the debt tranches of Sterling Global from the secondary market, I am also your primary creditor. Julian surged forward, his hand slamming onto the obsidian table. This is a joke. This has to be a joke. You? You were a failure. You stole 50 million. We kicked you out because you were a parasite. I didn't steal a dime, Julian, I said, leaning forward until I was inches from his face. You and I both know who spent that money. You spent it on the Azure account, trying to double down on a failing short in Singapore. I have the logs now. I bought the servers that held your secrets, too. Julian flinched as if I'd struck him. He looked at Alistair, but Alistair wasn't looking at his golden boy anymore. He was looking at the nameplate on the desk *Silas Sterling*. You built this? Alistair asked, his voice a mere whisper. In 5 years? Without a cent from me? I built it because I didn't have a cent from you, Alistair, I replied. I built it in the dirt you left me in. And now, you've walked into my bank, into my world, to ask me to save yours. Beatrice suddenly found her voice, her eyes welling with calculated tears. Silas, darling, we're family. Blood is thicker than. Blood is just a liquid, Mother, I interrupted. And right now, your family's blood is in a state of total insolvency. You didn't come here for family. You came here because you thought you could manipulate a dead man's ghost. Instead, you found the one you murdered. I stood up and walked toward the window, looking out over the city. I could hear them breathing, the shallow, panicked breaths of people who had spent their whole lives holding others under the water, only to realize they were the ones who couldn't swim. The Gables is already in foreclosure, I said, not turning around. The Sterling Global headquarters is being liquidated as we speak. Your personal accounts have been frozen by the SEC due to Julian's creative accounting. Silas, please, Alastair said. It was the first time in my life I had ever heard him use that word. It felt wrong in his mouth. We can fix this. With Sovereign's backing, we can restructure. We can put the Sterling name back on top. I turned around then, a cold smile touching my lips. The Sterling name is already on top, Alastair. It's on the door of this building. It's on the letterhead of the most powerful bank in this city. It's just not your Sterling name anymore. I walked back to the table and picked up a thick folder. I tossed it in front of Alastair. What is this? He asked, his hands shaking as he touched the edge of the paper. It's an offer, I said. A very specific one. You have exactly 10 minutes to read it before I have security escort you out of my building. And trust me, Alastair, by the time you reach the lobby, the world is going to look very different for the family disappointment. Alastair opened the folder, and as his eyes scanned the first page, his face went from pale to ghostly white. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of horror and realization. He finally understood that I wasn't just here to refuse them alone. I was here to take everything they had left, and the most terrifying part was that I hadn't even started. You wouldn't, Alastair choked out. Watch me, I replied. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, marking the seconds of their crumbling empire. They were trapped in the high-altitude cage I had built for them, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt the true weight of my name. The board was set, the pieces were in place, and the Sterling family was about to learn that the boy they called a disappointment had learned the most important lesson of all, how to never let them see the next move coming. Alastair's hands weren't just shaking, they were vibrating with a primal kind of terror. He turned the pages of the document, his eyes darting across the legalese and the cold, hard figures. The offer I had placed in front of him wasn't a lifeline. It was an invitation to his own execution, packaged in high-grade linen paper. This is a total hostile takeover of the family estate, Alastair stammered, looking up at me as if I were a stranger he had just met in a dark alley. The Gables? My shares? You're asking for everything, Silas. You're asking for the Sterling legacy for pennies on the dollar. I'm not asking for it, Alastair, I corrected him, leaning back in my leather chair. I'm offering to take the liability off your hands before the federal agents knock on your door tomorrow morning. Sterling Global is a sinking ship, and Julian here didn't just hit an iceberg, he steered right into it while looking for a shortcut to the Caymans. Julian, who had been uncharacteristically silent, suddenly slammed his fist onto the mahogany table. You arrogant little prick. You think because you have a fancy office and a name on a door that you can talk to us like this? I'm the one who ran the company for the last 3 years while you were, what? Playing with spreadsheets in some basement? I didn't blink. I didn't even look at him. I kept my eyes on Alastair. Julian, you're running the company involved leveraging 80% of our liquid assets into a speculative crypto mining farm in a country that doesn't even have a stable power grid. You didn't just lose the money, you violated 3 different SEC regulations regarding fiduciary duty. The family disappointment is currently the only person in this room who isn't headed for a minimum security prison. Vivian, my younger sister, let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. She was dressed in a Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, but her face was a mask of pure panic. Silas, stop it. This isn't funny. If the company goes under, my trust fund, the house, our reputation. We won't be able to show our faces at the gala next month, you have to fix this. The gala? I turned my gaze to her, and she flinched. Vivian, by next month, you won't even have a credit card that clears at a Starbucks. You came here because you want to maintain your lifestyle. Julian came here to save his skin. And Father. Father came here because he realized that the son he cut off, the son he told would never amount to anything more than a footnote in the Sterling history, is now the only man on the planet with the liquidity to stop the wolves at the door. Beatrice reached out, her fingers grazing my sleeve with a delicacy that felt like a spider's web. Silas, darling, we were hard on you, yes. But we did it to make you strong. We did it to prepare you for the world. Look at you now, you're the CEO of your own bank. Our plan worked. You should be thanking us. The sheer audacity of her words sent a cold chill through my chest. Your plan? I pulled my arm away. Your plan was to leave me with $1,000 and a suitcase in the middle of a recession. Your plan was to tell everyone in our social circle that I had a substance problem, to explain why I wasn't at the board meetings anymore. Your plan was to let me starve while you threw $1 million birthday parties for Julian. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below us, the city was a grid of lights, a hive of commerce that I had spent every waking second of the last 5 years conquering. I remember the day you kicked me out, I said, my voice low and steady. I sat at that long dining table at the Gables, and you, Alistair, told me I was genetically deficient when it came to business. You told me I lacked the sterling spine. You said I would be lucky to find a job as a bank teller. I turned around to face them. So, I took your advice. I got a job at a bank. And then I bought the bank. And then I merged that bank with 3 others. And then I created Sovereign. I did it under a different name initially so you wouldn't see me coming. I built this empire in the shadows while you were too busy basking in your own reflected glory. 7 minutes left, I said, checking my watch. Silas, please, Alistair said, his voice cracking. If I sign this, I'm left with nothing. I'll be a tenant in my own home. Not a tenant, Alistair. A guest. At my mercy. That's the deal. I buy Sterling Global. I absorb the debt. I pay off the SEC to keep Julian out of a jumpsuit, for now. In exchange, you sign over every asset, every deed, and every share to Sterling Sovereign. You retire quietly. You tell the world that you've decided to hand over the reins to the most capable member of the family. Julian lunged across the table, reaching for the folder, but I didn't move. My head of security, a man named Marcus who looked like he could stop a freight train with his bare hands, stepped out from the shadows near the door. Julian stopped, his face turning a mottled purple. You're a monster, Julian hissed. No, I replied. I'm a banker. And I've learned that the most valuable asset in any transaction isn't money. It's leverage. And right now, Julian, you have 0. Beatrice started to sob, real tears this time, born from the realization that her jewelry, her status, and her power were all dissolving in the air of my office. We're your parents, Silas. How can you be so heartless? I learned from the best, Mother. I remember calling you when I was sleeping in my car that first month. I told you I was sick, that I needed help with a deposit for an apartment. Do you remember what you said? Beatrice looked away, her lips trembling. You said, Silas, we don't reward failure in this house. Call us when you found your spine. Well, I found it. It's made of steel and high-interest debt, and it's currently holding up the ceiling of this entire building. I walked back to the desk and picked up a pen, a heavy silver fountain pen Alistair had given Julian for his graduation, the same pen I had bought at an estate auction after Julian lost it in a poker game 3 years ago. I slid it across the table toward my father. 5 minutes, Alistair. If you don't sign, I call my contacts at the Wall Street Journal. I'll give them the full breakdown of Julian's creative accounting. By the time the markets open tomorrow, Sterling Global will be worth less than the paper this contract is printed on. You'll be bankrupt, disgraced, and Julian will be facing 20 years. Alistair looked at the pen. He looked at Julian, who was shaking his head in a desperate, silent plea. Then he looked at me. For the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't disappointment or disdain. It was respect. A twisted, terrified kind of respect. He realized that I had become exactly what he always wanted, a predator. But he hadn't realized that a predator doesn't care about the pack that abandoned him. If I sign. Alistair's voice was a ghost of its former self. Do you promise to keep the Sterling name alive? The name is already alive, Alistair. Look at the door. Look at the letterhead. I am the sterling name now. You're just the man who used to have it. With a hand that shook so violently he had to steady it with his other arm, Alistair gripped the pen. He turned to the final page of the document. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his eyes scanning the clause that stripped him of his pride, his home, and his legacy. Then, he signed. One signature. Then another for the transfer of the deeds. Then a third for the power of attorney. When he finished, he dropped the pen. It clattered on the table, sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. There, Alistair whispered. It's done. You have everything. Not everything, I said, picking up the folder and checking the signatures. I have what was owed to me. The interest on 5 years of being the family disappointment is quite high, Alistair. I stood up and buzzed my secretary. Sarah, please escort the Sterlings to the lobby. And call my legal team. Tell them the acquisition of Sterling Global is complete. We start the liquidation of the executive board at 8 a.m. sharp. Vivian stood up, her face pale. Silas, can I stay? Just for a moment? We used to be close, remember? When we were kids. I looked at my younger sister, the girl who had watched me get kicked out and didn't even say goodbye because she was too worried it would affect her allowance. Vivian, the only thing we have in common now is a last name, and as of 5 minutes ago, I'm the one who pays for the maintenance of that name. Go home. Pack your things. You have 48 hours before the locks on the townhome are changed. You can't, she shrieked. I can. I own the building now, I said, returning to my computer. I suggest you look for something in a more modest neighborhood. It'll be a good exercise in finding your spine. As Marcus guided them toward the door, Alistair stopped. He turned back, looking at me one last time. He looked smaller than he had when he walked in. The lion had been declawed, and he knew it. You really hate us that much? He asked. I didn't look up from my screen. Hate requires an emotional investment, Alistair. I don't hate you. I've simply balanced the books. And as it turns out, the Sterling family was deep in the red. The door clicked shut. I was alone in my office, the silence heavy and cold. I looked at the signatures on the paper, the final proof that the empire had fallen. I should have felt a surge of triumph, a rush of adrenaline. But instead, all I felt was the quiet, clinical satisfaction of a job well done. I looked at the framed photo on my desk, not of my family, but of the small, dingy apartment I had lived in 5 years ago. It reminded me of where I started. It reminded me of the hunger. My phone buzzed. A text from my head of acquisitions, *, the press release is ready. We announce the merger at dawn. Are you ready for the fallout? Asterisk. I typed back a single word, absolutely. Asterisk. But as I looked at the door, I knew the real fallout hadn't even begun. My family thought they had lost their money and their homes. They hadn't realized that I wasn't just taking their assets. I was going to dismantle the Sterling name piece by piece until the only thing left was the bank I had built from their ashes. The game wasn't over, it had just moved into the second phase, and in this phase, I wasn't just the CEO. I was the judge, the jury, and the man holding the keys to their future. The headlines hit the wires at exactly 6 a.m. I watched them scroll across the Bloomberg terminal in my office, a rhythmic pulse of digital ink that signaled the death of one era and the birth of another. Sterling Sovereign Private Bank acquires Sterling Global in shock hostile takeover, one read. Another was more personal, the discarded heir returns, Silas Sterling liquidates father's empire. The financial world was reeling, but inside the glass walls of my sanctuary, it was deathly quiet. I took a sip of black coffee, feeling the heat settle in my chest. My phone had been vibrating incessantly for an hour, calls from journalists, former board members, and, predictably, my family. I ignored them all. I wasn't interested in their shock. I was interested in their realization. By 9 a.m., the first of them arrived. It wasn't Alistair. He was likely sequestered with a bottle of scotch and a team of lawyers who were currently telling him he had no ground to stand on. It was Julian. My older brother didn't wait for my secretary to announce him. He burst through the double mahogany doors of my executive suite, his expensive Italian suit wrinkled, his hair, usually perfectly slicked back, disheveled. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck, only to find out the shore was owned by the person he'd pushed overboard. "Silas! What the hell is this?" he roared, slamming a printed copy of the merger agreement onto my desk. "You can't do this. You can't just dissolve the board. I'm the chief operating officer. I have a contract." I didn't look up immediately. I finished the sentence I was typing, hit save, and then slowly leaned back, interlacing my fingers. "Correction, Julian. You had a contract. Under the change of control clause in your executive agreement, a clause, I might add, that you insisted on including to protect yourself from outside buyers, the new owner has the right to terminate all C-suite positions with a fixed severance. I am that owner. And your severance is being mailed to your primary residence today. Or rather, the residence you'll be vacating by the end of the month." Julian's face went from a heated red to a sickly gray. "You're firing me? After everything I did for this name?" I stayed. I worked. I was the one who kept the Sterling legacy alive while you were playing around with your little startup. "My little startup just swallowed your legacy whole," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And let's be honest about your work, Julian. You didn't keep the legacy alive. You bled it dry. You spent more time on the company jet than in the boardroom. You authorized 3 different bailouts from Alistair's personal accounts just to keep the stock price from cratering. You weren't a leader, you were a mascot for a dying brand. You're a monster," he hissed, his hands shaking. "I'm a banker," I corrected. "And in banking, Julian, there is no room for sentiment. You called me the family disappointment for years. You sat at those Sunday dinners and laughed while Alistair told stories about how I lacked the Sterling spine. Well, look around. This spine built a bank that manages assets your company couldn't dream of. This spine just took everything you own without firing a single shot." Julian opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. He looked around my office, the original art, the view of the skyline, the sheer gravity of the power I had amassed. He realized, for the first time, that he wasn't the protagonist of this story. He was a footnote. "Get out, Julian," I said, turning back to my monitor. "And tell Vivian to stop calling my personal assistant. Her credit cards were linked to the corporate account. I canceled them an hour ago." As he stumbled out, defeated and broken, the door hadn't even fully closed before my intercom buzzed. "Sir, your mother is here. She says it's urgent." I sighed. Beatrice Sterling. The woman who had mastered the art of looking the other way. When Alistair had screamed at me to leave, she had been busy adjusting the floral arrangement on the dining table. When I had called her a year later, struggling to pay rent and asking for nothing more than a conversation, she had told me it was best to follow your father's wishes for a while. "Send her in," I said. Beatrice walked in with the grace of a woman who had never known a day of true hardship. Her pearls were perfect, her coat was silk, and her expression was one of practiced, maternal concern. It was a mask I knew well. "Silas, darling," she began, her voice soft and melodic. "This has all gone quite far, hasn't it?" I spoke to Alistair. He's very distraught. He's not a young man anymore, Silas. This kind of stress isn't good for him." "Stress is a natural consequence of failure, Mother," I replied, not moving from my chair. "I'm sure he'll manage." She sat down across from me, her eyes sweeping over the office. "You've done so well for yourself. We had no idea. If we had known you were building something so magnificent, things would have been different." "That's the most honest thing you've ever said," I laughed, a cold, dry sound. "If you had known I was rich, you would have loved me. But I wasn't rich then. I was just your son. And that wasn't enough for either of you. Silas, don't be cruel. We're family. Family is a bond of mutual respect and support, Mother. What we had was a transactional arrangement based on the sterling name. I stopped being part of that transaction the day I was kicked out. Now, I'm the one setting the terms. Beatrice leaned forward, her composure finally slipping. What do you want, then? Do you want us to beg? Is that what this is? You've taken the company, you've taken the house, you've embarrassed your father in front of every peer he has. When is it enough? I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city that I had conquered while they were sleeping. It's enough when the name Sterling Global no longer exists. I'm rebranding the entire firm under the Sovereign banner. The Sterling name, the one you and Alistair were so protective of, will be erased from the building, the letterhead, and the history books. I'm not just taking your money, Mother. I'm taking your identity. She gasped, her hand flying to her throat. You'd erase your own heritage? My heritage started 5 years ago in a 1,200-square-foot office with 3 employees and a dream of never being looked down upon again, I said, turning to face her. The sterling heritage you're so proud of is just a collection of old debts and even older prejudices. I'm doing the world a favor by burying it. You're a cold man, Silas, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears that I knew were more about her lost status than my lost soul. I learned from the best, I replied. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a bank to run. Your car is waiting downstairs. I suggest you and Alistair start looking at properties in the countryside. Something quiet. Something far away from the world you think you still lead. She left without another word, her shoulders slumped, the weight of the new reality finally settling on her. I sat back down, but I didn't feel the emptiness people often describe after a confrontation. I felt focused. The liquidation was proceeding on schedule. The Sterling Global assets were being integrated into Sovereign's portfolio. My net worth had tripled overnight, but that wasn't the metric I cared about. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a restricted number. I knew who it was. I picked it up. Speak, I said. You think you've won, Alistair's voice came through the line, gravelly and weak, yet still trying to find that old authoritative tone. You think because you played some clever games with the market that you're the master of the house. I don't think it, Alistair. I own the house. Literally. I'm looking at the deed for the estate right now. It's quite a beautiful property. I'm thinking of turning the West Wing into a gallery for young artists who were disappointments to their families. What do you think? I will fight you, Silas. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years. I will make sure everyone knows you're a traitor to your own blood. With what money? I asked calmly. Your personal accounts were leveraged against the company's performance. When I triggered the forced acquisition, those margins were called. You're currently sitting on enough cash to live comfortably in a 3-bedroom condo, Alistair, but the days of private drivers, country clubs, and litigating your children into submission are over. You're just a retiree now. A man with a very expensive watch and nowhere to go. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing. For a moment, I thought he might actually apologize. I thought he might finally say the words he should have said 5 years ago. I should have broken you when you were a child, he snarled. I saw the weakness in you then. I should have known you were waiting to bite the hand that fed you. The hand didn't feed me, Alistair. It slapped me. And then it pointed to the door. You didn't make me, and you certainly can't break me. I am the result of everything you threw away. I hung up. I turned my chair toward the window again. The sun was high in the sky now, illuminating the Sterling Sovereign logo etched into the glass of my office. It was a new day, but the game wasn't over. There was one final piece to the puzzle. I picked up my desk phone and dialed my head of security. Marcus, is the delivery ready? Yes, sir. It's being moved to the Sterling estate as we speak. Good. I want it placed right in the center of the foyer. I want it to be the last thing they see before they leave. Consider it done, Mr. Sterling. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and headed for the elevator. It was time to visit the family home one last time. Not as a son, not as a guest, and certainly not as a disappointment. I was going there as the landlord, coming to inspect the ruins of an empire that had tried to bury me, only to find that I was a seed. The drive to the estate was surreal. The long, winding driveway that used to feel like a path to a gilded cage now felt like a victory lap. As my car pulled up to the massive stone steps, I saw the moving trucks already parked in the distance. The staff, people who had known me since I was a boy, stood in a line, their heads bowed in a mixture of fear and respect. I stepped out of the car and walked into the foyer. Alistair was there, standing at the base of the grand staircase. He was holding a single suitcase. Beatrice was beside him, her eyes red from crying. Julian and Vivian were huddled in the corner, looking like children who had been caught stealing, but their eyes weren't on me. They were on the object I had ordered to be delivered. In the center of the marble foyer sat a massive, bronze statue. It was a replica of the very first office desk I had ever owned, the cheap, scratched-up wooden one I'd bought from a thrift store when I started my bank. And on top of that bronze desk was a plaque with words that I knew would haunt Alistair for the rest of his life. Asterisk from the ashes of a disappointment, an empire was built. Sovereign Bank, the price of silence is paid in full. Asterisk. Alistair looked at the statue, then at me. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, but beneath it, I saw the flicker of something else. Fear. For the first time in his life, he was looking at someone he couldn't control. "It's time to go, Alistair," I said, my voice echoing in the vast, empty hall. "The new owners are arriving at noon. And they have very strict rules about trespassers." He opened his mouth, his jaw working as if he wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He simply gripped his suitcase, turned his back on me, and walked out the door he had once used to banish me. One by one, the rest followed. Beatrice didn't look at me. Julian muttered a curse under his breath. Vivian just sobbed. I stood in the center of the foyer, alone in the house that had never felt like home. I looked at the bronze statue of my humble beginnings, and for the first time in 5 years, I let out a long, slow breath. The debt was settled. The books were closed, but as I looked at the empty rooms, I realized that the real work was just beginning. I didn't just want to replace their bank. I wanted to build a legacy that would make the name Sterling stand for something other than greed and arrogance. I wanted to be the man they said I could never be. I walked out to my car, leaving the house behind. As we drove down the driveway, I didn't look back. I pulled out my laptop and opened a new file. Phase 3, Expansion, I typed. The family was gone, but the world was still waiting. And I was just getting started. 6 months later, the name Sterling Sovereign wasn't just a threat to my father's legacy, it had surpassed it. I stood in my corner office on the top floor of the new headquarters, looking out over the city. On my desk lay a copy of the Financial Times. The headline read, "Sterling Global declares bankruptcy, Sovereign Private Bank acquires remaining assets." It was the final nail in the coffin. I thought back to the look on Alistair's face the day I kicked them out of the estate. He had spent his whole life building a fortress of arrogance, only to realize he'd built it on sand. My mother, Beatrice, had reached out a few times, her emails filled with a mix of forced affection and desperate pleas for financial assistance. I didn't respond. Julian tried to get a job at one of my subsidiary firms under an alias, but my background checkers caught him within an hour. As for Vivian, she was the only one who seemed to truly understand. She sent me a short note, "You were the only one of us who was actually a Sterling, the rest of us were just pretenders." I realized then that the greatest revenge wasn't taking their house or their money. It was the fact that I no longer needed their validation. For years, I carried the weight of being the disappointment, thinking I was broken because I didn't reflect their image. But standing here now, I know the truth. I wasn't a disappointment, I was a disruption. They walked into my bank expecting to see a failure, but they walked out realizing they were the ones who had lost everything. They lost their empire because they valued power over people, and greed over integrity. I built Sovereign not just to spite them, but to prove that a sterling could actually stand for something honorable. Success is a loud answer to a quiet lie. If you've ever been told you're not enough, or that your dreams are a waste of time, remember my story. The people who try to bury you often forget that you are a seed. Let their doubt be your fuel, and let your results be your voice. Today, the sterling name finally means something again. Not because of the shadow Alistair cast, but because of the light I chose to build. If this story reminded you that your worth isn't defined by those who can't see your potential, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below if you've ever turned a setback into a comeback, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice. Thank you for watching my journey from the family disappointment to the man who owns the door. Take care of yourselves, and keep building. The end.